So remember the 2008 financial crisis? Yeah, well, for more than a decade, we were told the system was fixed. The biggest banks were made safer, the rules were tougher. But in this explainer, we're going to look at why in 2023 that crisis came roaring back. And it raises a huge question. Is too big to fail a problem we just can't solve?
And it all really kicked off in the spring of 2023. We saw this series of just shocking bank failures that felt like a ghost from the past. It proved that this problem, the one we thought was buried, was actually very much alive. And the speed of it all, it was absolutely breathtaking.
I mean, just look at how fast this went down. On March 10th, Silicon Valley Bank implodes. Just 2 days later, boom, Signature Bank is shut down. Before the month is even over, the massive global bank Credit Suisse needs an emergency rescue. And by May 1st, First Republic is gone, sold off for parts. The dominoes just fell faster than anyone could have imagined.
And the panic was on a whole other level. This wasn't your grandfather's bank run, with people lining up around the block. No, this was a digital bank run. It was fueled by social media, WhatsApp groups, and banking apps. $40 billion pulled out in a single day. The old rules were just not built for that kind of speed.
Which, of course, brings us to the big question, right? After all those years building new rules, new stress tests, all these financial firewalls, how in the world do we end up right back here, with governments having to step in to stop a total meltdown? To answer that, we really have to go back and understand the core concept itself. Because this idea of too big to fail, well, it isn't just about a bank's size. It's about this really dangerous feedback loop that is just incredibly hard to break.
At its heart, too big to fail basically means a bank is so woven into the fabric of the economy that if it collapsed, it would trigger this catastrophic chain reaction. It would take everything down with it. And that's exactly why, when push comes to shove, the government feels like it has no choice but to step in and rescue it.
Now, the real poison here is something called moral hazard. It's this vicious cycle. Here's how it works. First, everyone believes the government will bail out the bank. Because of that belief, they see it as a super safe bet and lend it money at cheaper rates. Step 3, the bank, now flush with cheap money and that safety net, has every incentive to take on huge risks to chase huge profits. And eventually, those risks blow up, which causes the crisis that forces the government to provide the bailout everyone expected from the start. It's a completely self-fulfilling prophecy.
So after 2008, regulators said, okay, never again. They knew they had to break this cycle. So they built this whole new architecture of rules specifically designed to make sure a giant bank could fail without taking the rest of us down with it. Okay, a key part of this was identifying what are called global systemically important banks, or G-SIBs for short. The logic is actually pretty simple. The bigger and more connected you are, the more extra cash, like a loss-absorbing cushion, you have to hold. So you can see here a bank like JP Morgan Chase, they're in the highest bucket. They're required to hold a whole 2.5% extra capital just in case things go wrong. The other big tool was the living will. It's basically a pre-packaged plan for an orderly shutdown. The main strategy is called single point of entry. The idea is you let the parent company at the very top go bust, but you keep its day-to-day banks, where you and I have our accounts, open and running. That way the big shareholders and creditors take the hit, not the public, and the whole system doesn't grind to a halt. So, we had more capital, we had a clear plan for failure, the system seemed way more robust. But then, in 2023, the first G-SIB actually failed. And guess what happened? The entire playbook was thrown right out the window. And that was the case with Credit Suisse. Instead of using that new resolution plan, Swiss authorities basically panicked and forced a merger with its rival, UBS. The result? A new mega bank with assets that are almost double the size of Switzerland's entire annual economy. So they didn't solve the problem, they created an even bigger one. Now they have a bank that might not just be too big to fail, but too big to save, at least by its own country.
So when they were faced with a real crisis in real time, the authorities just blinked. They went back to an old-school, government-backed merger instead of trusting the very system they had spent 10 years building for exactly this moment.
And this just leaves this deeply troubling question for the entire global financial system. I mean, if the living will wasn't used for the very first G-SIB to go down, has the whole project to end too big to fail just lost all credibility? Will politicians ever really have the nerve to pull the trigger? But the story doesn't end there, not even close. Because while regulators were so busy trying to beef up the traditional banks, something huge was happening in the background. The risk didn't just disappear, it moved. It moved into the shadows, into a place with way fewer rules and a lot less oversight.
Get this, for the first time in history, the majority of global financial assets are now held outside the traditional banking system. This is the world of shadow banking. We're talking about giant investment funds, private credit, hedge funds, the whole shebang. It's a sector that has ballooned to over $250 trillion.
And it's not just how big it is, it's how fast it's growing, nearly double the pace of old-school banks. Now, what really has regulators worried is what's called the narrow measure. These are the parts of the shadow system doing the riskiest, most bank-like stuff. And that slice is growing the fastest of all, at 12% a year, mostly hidden from supervisors.
So, after all of that, where does this leave us in the fight to tame these financial giants? Well, the reality of risk in our system has fundamentally changed.
The new reality is that the problem hasn't been solved, it's just evolved. That moral hazard that encourages banks to gamble, yep, still with us. Digital tech has put bank runs on hyperspeed, and as we've seen, all that risk has just moved into the shadows. But maybe most important of all, when a real crisis hits, the political instinct is always to save the system now and worry about the rules later.
And this leaves us with one final, pretty unsettling thought. What if too big to fail isn't some temporary bug in the system that we can patch? What if it's a permanent, unfixable feature of our complex global economy? Maybe the problem isn't that we haven't found the right solution, but that one just might not exist.